Thank you so much for joining us today. It's my pleasure to introduce Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party. Keir will speak about our shared future and why we need a socially just devolution of power right across the UK, in Scotland, Wales, England and Northern Ireland. People often talk about their commitment to the UK, to our shared future, as a matter of economics, the money in our pockets. As Labour's Shadow Chancellor, I understand and agree with those arguments. It's essential we work together. We're currently mired in the worst recession of any major economy and are predicted to experience the slowest recovery too. Scotland's levels of unemployment, the worst in the UK, are deeply worrying. The blame game we've seen between Holyrood and Westminster has done nothing to help. But commitment to our shared future, to ensuring social justice, is a matter for our hearts as well as our pockets. We have ties that bind, emotional ties as well as economic ties. As a Scot myself, born in Aberdeenshire and now representing an English constituency, I know that well. I saw those ties throughout the summer when I toured our home nations and met people united in resilience in the face of this awful pandemic. Time and time again, people rightly said to me that it would be by acting together as communities and as a country that we would get through. We have a shared history, as Keir will speak to. And, as he'll also go on to say, we have a shared future. A future where people right across our country can wield power themselves in their own communities and workplaces, not have it wielded over them. A future where success for our young people doesn't have to mean getting out in order to get on. That means equality of opportunity, not just between all our four nations, but within them. Under the SNP, we know that's not been the case. In the 8 years after the SNP won a majority in Holyrood, income inequality between the richest and poorest parts of Scotland got worse. And we have a shared future when it comes to tackling the challenges we all face, not least the climate crisis. The eyes of the world will be on the UK and Glasgow in particular as we host the COP conference next year. It has been all too clear this year that the status quo in Westminster and Holyrood is not serving people well. As we all look to a future beyond the pandemic, we cannot go back to business as usual. People right across the UK want to see change that will make life better and more secure for all of us. As you will hear, Keir is absolutely committed to delivering that change and to the future of our union. This speech is just the start. I'm so proud to be introducing him now as we set out on that road.
Thank you so much, Annalisa, and thank you for everything you do for our party. Good morning. I want to start by addressing the emerging situation relating to the pandemic. The news over the last 24 hours has been deeply, deeply disturbing. The number of coronavirus cases has nearly doubled in the last week, and over 67,000 people have now tragically died, and hospital admissions are rising. We cannot be in any doubt. The virus is now out of control. International flights have been banned, international borders have been shut, and there's now severe disruption at British ports. Make no mistake, this is now a real emergency. Now, I have faith in the British people to once again step up to the challenges, as they've done at every stage of the pandemic. But they expect the government to do the same. We can have no more over-promising and false hope, no more confused messages and slow decision-making. We need strong, clear and decisive leadership. The Prime Minister needs to be straight with people about precisely what's going on and precisely what he is going to do about it. He must address the nation today after this morning's Cobra meeting and then hold daily press conferences until the disruption has eased. He must also get the Brexit deal he promised. He's got to get it done this week. This is not a game of brinkmanship. This is people's lives, people's jobs, and people's businesses. They need a deal. They expect a deal. And a deal is what must happen. Now, I renew my pledge to act in the national interest, to help us through these dark and difficult days. We will support further restrictions where they're necessary. We will work with the government to help businesses get through the winter months. And we will offer constructive solutions to keep our NHS open and the vaccine distributed. As we struggle against the pandemic and the profound health and economic consequences of it, making the case for our United Kingdom could never be more important. We entered this pandemic together. We faced the enduring challenges of the pandemic together. We will come out of it together. And we must rebuild together. The duty to rebuild will be a shared duty. It's not a duty just in England, Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland. It's a duty across all 4 nations together. And believe you me, future generations will not forgive us if we shirk that responsibility. And that is why the case I want to make today is the case for the United Kingdom. Now, of course, there's a case for the United Kingdom that can be measured in power, prosperity, trade, and security. We are all stronger because we choose to pool our resources, to share the risks and rewards. We are all better off because we can live, work, and trade across borders rather than behind them. And as one United Kingdom, we're better able to weather the storms of a global financial crash, a pandemic, or the climate emergency. But for me, the case for the United Kingdom goes much deeper than that. The United Kingdom is shaped not just by our shared institutions, but by the people who made them, the history and the experience that shaped them, and the amazing things that we've achieved together. Together, we fought slavery, we fought poverty, we fought fascism, and we're fighting COVID. The first baby born in the NHS, Naira Thomas, was born in South Wales and named after the great Nye Bevan. Our welfare state was born out of the struggles of early Scottish activists who fought against the Scottish Poor Laws. Britain's great achievements in science, innovation and discovery are all the greater because they draw on all of our talents. The Open University was founded by a Scot, Jenny Lee. We're a world leader in education, research and knowledge because of our great universities and our shared tradition of learning. The Labour Party was first led by Keir Hardie, a Scot, who ended up representing a Welsh constituency. And such was the influence of that boy from Lanarkshire that many years later, in a family in Oxford, East Surrey, decided to call their son Keir too. My point is this: our nations are bound by our history, our values, and our identity. Our families live across borders. Our businesses operate across borders. We're interconnected and we're interdependent. And that's not just a precious inheritance, a description of the past. It's what we are. It's what I want for our children, for the next generation. I don't believe in putting up borders across any part of our United Kingdom, in dividing people, communities and families who've stood together for so long. It's not England or Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland. I've had enough of hearing that. It's England and Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland together. I believe in that core Labour principle that we achieve more together than we do alone. All four nations working together to build a more open, more optimistic and outward-looking country. A United Kingdom that's a force for social justice and a moral force for good in the world. And that's why I'm so determined to preserve and to renew the United Kingdom. But just as I believe in the United Kingdom, I equally believe in devolving power and opportunity across it. That is the common thread that joins so many great figures of the Scottish Labour movement, from John Mackintosh and Donald Dewar to John Smith and Gordon Brown. A tradition that doesn't simply see devolution as a process of shifting power from one place to another, but that sees devolution as a means to an end, to empower, to democratise and to deliver social justice. The challenge for Labour now is how to carry on that tradition, to renew the case for devolution and to harness the energy, dynamism and creativity of all corners of the country. Devolution in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland was one of the proudest achievements of the last Labour government, against, I might add, the opposition of the Conservatives and the indifference of the SNP. But since Labour lost power in Holyrood in 2007 and then in Westminster in 2010, that renewal hasn't happened. In Westminster, successive Conservative governments have eroded the fabric of the United Kingdom. First, with a decade of austerity, which undermined our public services, widened inequalities, and made communities across the country poorer and less secure. And then came Brexit. Now, I know the Prime Minister is the only person in Britain who still wants to talk about Brexit. So I will just say this. Whichever side of the divide you were on, we can surely all agree that the cavalier and chaotic approach of the Conservatives has frayed the bonds of the United Kingdom. Take, for example, the Internal Markets Bill, which was railroaded through Westminster without concern for the impact it would have on devolution or the damage it would cause across the United Kingdom. That bill could have been a huge opportunity to push power outwards. But instead, the Prime Minister showed his instinct is to hoard power, not to devolve it. Now, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised, because we now know that the Prime Minister thinks Scottish devolution has been, in his words, a disaster. And the reason Johnson's comment struck home is because it spoke to a wider truth. They simply don't believe in devolution. They never have. And they're blind to the damage that their cavalier attitude is doing to our United Kingdom. They have no plan to counter Scottish separatism other than to defend the status quo. And to borrow the Prime Minister's own terminology, in Brexit and in austerity, they've given separatists two big boxing gloves to pummel the United Kingdom. And Scotland was once rightly proud and world-renowned for providing an exceptional education to children from all backgrounds and for being a society where anyone could reach their potential. But after 13 years of SNP in power, sadly, that's no longer the case. International comparisons show that children in Scotland are now lagging behind children in England and in many advanced countries for the first time. Scotland now has one of the largest average class sizes in any major economy. And the attainment gap between the poorest and the wealthiest children rises through each stage of primary education in Scotland. Under the last Labour government, child poverty in Scotland fell by 150,000. But under the SNP, child poverty has risen sharply and is forecast to reach 1 in 3 Scottish children by 2030. And I'm afraid it's the same story on public health. Life expectancy in Scotland is now the lowest in Western Europe, with Scottish men in the poorest areas expected to die 13 years before those in the least deprived areas. The Scottish NHS hasn't hit its cancer waiting times for 7 years. And in the first wave of COVID, the death rate in Scotland was the 3rd highest in Europe. Tragically, the percentage of COVID deaths in care homes was far higher than anywhere else in the UK. And just last week, we saw the appalling extent of the drugs crisis in Scotland. Scotland now has the worst death rate from drugs in Europe. And the SNP has also failed to build the modern, dynamic economy that Scotland deserves, or to protect Scottish manufacturing jobs, as we've seen with the shambolic handling of the BiFab plants in Fife and Lewis, and the loss of £52 million of taxpayers' money. So it's no wonder that Nicola Sturgeon wants to make next May's election a referendum on another referendum. Because on education, on health, on social justice, the SNP have no story to tell. Against that background, it's Labour's duty to offer a positive alternative to the Scottish people, to show that you don't have to choose between a broken status quo and the uncertainty and divisiveness of separatism. It's our duty, my duty, to make the alternative case for a devolved and socially just Scotland in a modern United Kingdom. I'm under no illusion about the scale of the task Labour faces. We've lost 4 general elections and the last 3 Scottish parliamentary elections. For over a decade, we've been in no position to decide anything or to change anyone's lives. That has to stop, and fast. Because when Labour loses elections, we fail in our historic mission. We fail the people of Scotland. And we allow the fabric of the United Kingdom to be weakened. So I want to talk directly to the people in Scotland who've given up on Labour and given up on the United Kingdom. I've spoken to many of you since becoming leader. I've heard the arguments you've made, and I've listened to your frustrations. I hear what you're saying. I understand why you feel as you do, and I'm not surprised. For a decade, there's been a Conservative government in Westminster with priorities that you don't share. And there's been a Labour opposition that keeps losing. When those are the alternatives, I can see why you've reached the conclusion that you have. But Boris Johnson isn't Britain, just as Nicola Sturgeon isn't Scotland. The United Kingdom is much more than that, more than any individual. It has been before, and it can be again, a great force for social justice, for security, and for solidarity. And under my leadership, we will do everything we can to win back your trust in Labour, but equally importantly, in the United Kingdom. I know that won't be easy. Labour has a mountain to climb, nowhere more than in Scotland. And that's why the first step on that journey is to reaffirm Labour's commitment to a United Kingdom based on social justice and solidarity, and to set out the means to that end. A new phase of radical economic and political devolution across the United Kingdom. The next phase of devolution. I want devolution and social justice to be the hallmarks of the next Labour government. In fact, I may be the first person ever to run to be Prime Minister of this country on a manifesto that will aim to win power and then push as much power as possible away from Westminster. And that is because I believe there's a desire across the United Kingdom for politics and power to be much closer to people. We saw this in the Brexit referendum, and we've been ignoring it for years. Unless we grasp the nettle and deliver real devolution of power and resources, we won't be able to renew our United Kingdom for the 2020s and the 2030s. We won't be able to tackle the root causes of the appalling inequalities and injustices that we see across all our regions and nations. And we won't be able to make Britain the country I know it can be, the best place to grow up in and the best place to grow old in. The case for the next phase of devolution was urgent before COVID, but the pandemic has put rocket boosters under it. Our Labour Council leaders, mayors and metro mayors have stood up for their communities against a centralised Westminster knows best response. A national crisis on this scale should have been the time for central government to work with and empower local communities, to bring the country together. But too often the UK government's approach has been to pit council against council, town against town, city against city, mayor against mayor. It's no surprise that many local leaders I've spoken to have felt distanced and ignored on decisions that have huge consequences on people's jobs, lives and their communities. This has got to change. And that's why I'm announcing today that Labour will launch a UK-wide constitutional commission to consider how power, wealth and opportunity can be devolved to the most local level. Now, this won't be an exercise in shifting power from one parliament to another, or of moving a few jobs out of London, or to devolve and forget. This will be the boldest project Labour has embarked on for a generation, and every bit as bold and radical as the programme of devolution that Labour delivered in the 1990s and the 2000s. It will consider all parts of the United Kingdom. It will focus on delivering real and lasting economic and political devolution across our towns, our communities, and to people across the country. It'll start with listening to people in their local communities about what they want. It'll look at the successes of devolution so far, but also where it's fallen short. I'll consider everything from how people have more of a say in what happens in their community, to how we can break down barriers to democracy and participation. It'll consider how we can make sure that powers coming back from Brussels are not just centralised in Westminster, but are shared across the regions and nations of the United Kingdom. It will be particularly important for the Commission to hear from and work with our great mayors and council leaders, and to use their experience and ideas to guide our next steps. The Commission will also make the positive case for the United Kingdom, and it will champion devolution. But beyond that, it will rule nothing out. And I will look at the conclusions without preconceptions. It will have one overriding priority: to push power closer to people and to deliver a more democratic and socially just United Kingdom. It will put our nations and regions at its centre, our metro mayors, local leaders and councillors. It will involve all parts of the Labour movement, our members, our trade unions and our supporters. And it will welcome community organisations, grassroots groups and movements for change. Above all, it will hear direct from the British people. The Shadow Cabinet and I and everyone involved in the Commission will hear from as many people as possible across the United Kingdom. As soon as we can, we'll be out in local communities, in town halls, offices, colleges, factories and community centres. Because if this is going to work and to drive the radical change I know is needed across the country, this cannot and it will not be a project of Westminster, by Westminster and for Westminster. It will be of the people of the United Kingdom And I'm delighted that our last Labour Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, has agreed to be an advisor in the setting up of the Commission. Now, of course, a project of this scale and this urgency should be initiated by the UK government. But in the absence of that leadership from the Prime Minister, Labour will do what is necessary in opposition. And just as in 1997, we will make devolution a reality under the next Labour government. This will, of course, take time. But I expect the Scottish section, working with Scottish Labour and our leader, Richard Leonard, to be completed as soon as possible. Because, frankly, there's no time to waste. The Scottish parliamentary elections are just over 5 months away. Labour will fight those elections, making the case for a socially just Scotland in a modern United Kingdom. And we'll make clear that 5 more years of separatism and division isn't the answer to any of the challenges facing Scottish people. Whether that's on COVID, improving Scotland's schools and the NHS, protecting jobs and the economy, addressing the climate change emergency, or providing greater security at home and abroad. Ultimately, there's nothing that separatism can offer to a child living in poverty in Glasgow, just as there's nothing that nationalism can offer a child living in poverty in Camden. And the last thing Scotland needs now is more years of division. So Labour will argue passionately against another independence referendum. We'll argue that today, we'll argue that tomorrow. It would be the entirely wrong priority to hold another Scottish independence referendum in the teeth of the deepest recession for 300 years, while still fighting this pandemic, when there is such uncertainty about how Brexit and coronavirus will affect us, and when the costs and consequences of independence are still so uncertain. That's why Nicola Sturgeon's calls for an independence referendum in the early part of the next Scottish Parliament, perhaps even next year, is so misguided. Given the damage and division this would cause, no responsible First Minister should contemplate that, and no responsible Prime Minister would grant it. There should not be another independence referendum while our economic and health outlook is so precarious, nor until there's been a proper assessment of the costs, consequences and uncertainties of separation, including the future of Scotland's currency, our armed forces and national security, as well as the potential impact on pensions, jobs, taxes and social security of the Scottish people. The sterile debate between the status quo and independence won't answer these questions. And that's why our Commission must also ensure that there is a fresh and tangible offer in front of the Scottish people, a path to a socially just and secure Scotland within a modern United Kingdom. Because only then can we ensure that the discussion on our constitution is not a rerun of 2014, with the huge uncertainty of separation pitted against an outdated status quo. The Labour movement has a long and proud tradition of fighting for greater devolution and for social justice. For Labour, devolution has never been about power itself, but a means to build a fairer, more socially just society. Under my leadership, that will be our focus again. And if we get this right, then I believe Labour can play a key role in defeating the forces of separatism and once again make clear that it's only by harnessing the strength and dynamism of the whole United Kingdom that we can tackle the huge changes we all face. Because a separatist agenda won't solve inequality, injustice or poverty. It won't make us stronger on the international stage. And it won't make us better able to lead in the global fight against climate change. Separatism will leave us all weaker, just as defending the status quo will. That's why it's time to build a new partnership between our nations and regions to make Britain fit for the decades ahead. That is the challenge we face, and the Labour Party I lead must rise to that challenge. Thank you. I think now we're going to go to questions from the media, and I think first we should have the BBC's Nick Eardley. Nick.
Morning, Sir Keir. If I can ask you a question quickly about the COVID crisis. Given what you've just said, do you think Parliament should now be recalled, and should the Prime Minister be open to extending the transition period to focus on coronavirus? And on your speech, we've heard Labour talking about devolution for years now. And one of the lessons has been that devolution's easy when devolved leaders and national leaders agree. Are you prepared to take decisions which would potentially be difficult for Westminster, which would give devolved leaders the powers to make life uncomfortable for Westminster? And ultimately, if you are, should it not be for the Scottish Parliament to decide on whether there's another independence referendum?
Nick, on COVID, I do think there's a case, to look at whether we should recall Parliament. But I think, in a sense, more important than that is that the Prime Minister addresses the nation after the Cobra meeting, and does so on a daily basis whilst we go through this crisis, because people need to know what decisions are being made and they need to see the way forward. On the transition, I say to the Prime Minister, get the deal you promised. Get that deal over the line today or tomorrow. Don't delay. People were promised a deal and you must deliver on that deal. On the difficult decisions on devolution, I want, as I say, to put power as close to people as possible. And yes, that is uncomfortable in Westminster. Yes, that is uncomfortable for politicians and for a Prime Minister of this country, but I believe that that power has to go closer to people. On the question of a referendum, we will go into that election arguing against a referendum. And as I say, the idea of a further referendum whilst we're in the middle of this pandemic, I think only has to be set out to be seen to be absolutely the wrong priority. Thank you, Nick. Can I go to, I think, Paul Brand at ITV? Paul.
Just unmuting myself there, sorry, Sir Keir. Firstly, just to pick up on Nick's point and just to get a really clear answer from you on this, given the situation the country finds itself in at the moment, would you support an extension to the Brexit transition period? And if so, for how long? And just secondly, on the topic of your speech today, you've talked a lot about Scotland. Why do you think there are growing calls for independence in Labour-run Wales?
Thanks, Paul. On the extension to transition, I don't want an extension. I want the deal. The Prime Minister promised a deal. He said he had an oven-ready deal. He needs to get on and deliver that. And just delaying it further isn't going to help with the great uncertainty there already is for businesses. So I say to the Prime Minister, get on and deliver the deal that you promised. Get on to deliver it this week, today, tomorrow, and then we can recall Parliament and deal with it. On Scotland, and the speech I've just given is about the whole of the United Kingdom. And it is about a new devolution settlement for the whole of the United Kingdom. By that I mean across all the nations and all the regions, because I think there's a great yearning for power and decisions to be exercised closer to people. And that's why there's an emphasis on Scotland in the speech, but it's about UK devolution as a whole. Thank you, Paul. I think Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 is next. Gary.
Thank you. Just on your Scotland, United Kingdom theme, what do you say to voters in Scotland who've been driven to wanting independence because of Brexit? There's nothing in your menu of options that will let them reverse that, is there? And just one other on the UK, if I may. Why are you fighting shy of the word federalism? Does it go too far for you? And then on the lockdown, can I just ask, you describe a situation where the virus is out of control. Does that mean that we should actually move to full lockdown, in your opinion? Whether that means tier 4 everywhere or something that's actually called lockdown.
Gary, on those driven by Brexit, I think we all have to acknowledge that amongst the problems here and the drivers, if you like, for that sentiment in Scotland, it is a Westminster government that has completely different priorities to many people in Scotland, including on Brexit, coupled, I'm afraid, with the fact that we, the Labour opposition, keep losing. And that's the central issue that I'm trying to tackle in the speech that I've just given. And I'm not fighting shy of federalism. I've used that term in the past and I'll happily use it again. On the question of lockdown, we need to follow the science. There will be a review in 2 weeks, but it's really important that the government makes the right decision swiftly. And the problem in the last few weeks has been the problem throughout the pandemic, which is that the government has ignored the scientific advice, just as it did back in the autumn when it didn't go into a lockdown circuit break quickly enough. And it's done it again in relation to Christmas. Thank you, Gary. I think we're going to STV now with Colin.
Thanks, Sir Keir. Now, John P. Mackintosh, above all else, was a Democrat. When he was asked in 1974 if devolution could lead to independence, he said that if it becomes the settled will of the Scottish people, why not? You're saying why not, and you're ignoring potential democratic voices in Scotland when you're saying that no responsible Prime Minister would grant another referendum.
Colin, what I'm saying is that the very idea that in the middle of this pandemic, with the health consequences and the economic consequences, that we should have a further independence referendum, in a sense, only needs to be said to be seen to be wrong. The focus of everything we do in the coming months and years around the pandemic, which we're far from through. I mean, if you look at the events of the last few weeks, it's obvious we're right still in the middle of this crisis. The idea that this is the time for an independence referendum, I'm afraid, is one I just completely reject and disagree with. Thank you,
surely
Colin.
That's a decision for the Scottish people to decide.
Well, we will go into that election making the case I've just argued for, and making it clear that our argument is that this is not the time for a further divisive independence referendum, just at the time when we're still in the middle of tackling all of the issues under the pandemic. Thank you, Colin. Hannah, I think, is next. Hannah.
Hi, Sir Keir. Yeah, it was just a question about your speech, really. It was just you were talking about, preserving and renewing the United Kingdom. And surely the best way from your point of view to do this would be to, well, specifically in Scotland, would be, to increase the support for Scottish Labour. How do you plan to do this, given that you've got, the same people in the same positions, you've got the same leader, and quite frankly, you've got the same infighting going on day after day, week after week?
Hannah, you're absolutely right. It is vital that we rebuild trust in Labour, in Scottish Labour, in Scotland, and that's absolutely what I'm committed to doing every day, every week, every month into May of next year, and then on from there, working with Richard Leonard and Scottish Labour. And it is absolutely clear that in order to achieve that, we need to unite as a party, and I'm absolutely committed to that as well. But that is the challenge, and it's the challenge that I have to rise to, and I completely accept that. Hannah, thank you. I think we're going to the Daily Record with Paul.
Hi there, Keir. 2 points. You've said that you're against a referendum on independence. Would you be open to a referendum on more powers, that is, whatever package of reforms Labour comes up with for the Scottish Parliament? And secondly, just on the Scottish Labour leader, Richard Leonard, what would you say has been his main achievement as leader over the last 3 years?
On devolution, I absolutely believe there should be more devolution, and that's why the commission we're setting up will not rule anything out. I don't think that a referendum should be the next step. I don't think a referendum is necessary on that, but I absolutely believe in the principle of power going as close to people as possible. Holyrood feels as remote for many people as Westminster does, and so this has to be something that goes beyond that formal allocation of power. Richard Leonard is leading Scottish Labour. I've got a very strong working relationship with him, and we are working together on a campaign plan into May of next year, and we'll be working on that together between now and May. Thank you, Paul. Can I go to Kieran, I think, the Times Scotland. Kieran.
Thanks, Sir Keir. Can I ask, what do you think provides greater uncertainty to businesses? Is it an extension to the transition period, or is it a no-deal Brexit coupled with hauliers being blocked from leaving the country because of COVID?
Well, Kieran, the uncertainty at the moment is not knowing whether we're getting a deal or not. And businesses I've spoken to in Scotland and actually across the United Kingdom are tearing their hair out of that uncertainty, because the government is saying to them, prepare for this, prepare for that, but they don't know what they're preparing for. Their strong message to me is get the deal done. That's what you promised. Get the deal done, end the uncertainty, and let us get on with the preparation. They're equally clear, Kieran, that no deal would be a very, very bad outcome and a complete failure of the government, which is why I say to the government, you promised an oven-ready deal, get on and deliver it. And that's the very strong message I'm getting from businesses. Thank you, Kieran. I think we're going to the Express. Sam? Sam, you're mute, I think.
Apologies. Thanks,
That's all right.
Kit. Sadiq Khan has this morning called for an extension to the transition period. He's been backed by Stella Creasy. Labour is obviously still split over Brexit. Those divisions run deep. Why are they wrong to ask for that extension? And are you absolutely committing to not changing your mind on it?
Sam, thanks for that question. I think that it would be far better for the government to get the deal over the line today, tomorrow, or certainly this week. That is what businesses are crying out for. It's what the country is crying out for, and it's what we were promised. Simply delaying and dithering further, I don't think gets us anywhere. So I say to the Prime Minister, get that deal over the line, get the deal you promised. That's in the national interest. It's what businesses want, it's what our communities want, and it's what we absolutely need for our economy. So that's my priority. And then finally, I think we're going to Rachel at the HuffPost.
Can we take this intervention as a sign that you will be willing, if it comes to it, to personally lead the next campaign for the union? And if not, who do you think would be a good candidate for that job?
Rachel,
who do you think has shown better leadership during the COVID-19 crisis?
Look, I don't think there should be another referendum. That is the thrust of what I'm saying. But in making the passionate case for the United Kingdom, I'm absolutely prepared to be a champion and an advocate for the United Kingdom. But that case needs to be made without regard to a referendum. It's the case we should all be making passionately, because together we are so much stronger. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.